This program is brought to you from the Margaret Farrow Studio.
Rewind, Your Week in Review, is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.
This week on Rewind, Your Week in Review, the April election has come to a close. We recap the biggest takeaways and what the voter trends could mean for the midterms. Plus, a Dane County judge decides to stop a search for deleted text messages and emails on a top Republican cell phone. We tell you why. All this and more on Rewind, Your Week in Review for April 8th.
Hi, I'm Emilee Fannon.
And I'm J.R. Ross.
J.R., welcome back.
Thank
Glad
you.
to have you back after
Thanks.
some much-needed time off for yourself. Well, we have a busy week to recap this week in politics. So first, we're going to start with some of the highlights of the April 5th spring election. Probably the number one race that a lot of people were paying attention to was the Milwaukee mayoral race. I don't think it was any surprise, but it was also a historic win for Cavalier Johnson, becoming the first African-American mayor of Milwaukee. He talked about this in his victory speech, so let's first take a listen to that and we'll kind of dive in and what this means for the city.
It's because of you that after a 176-year history in this city, a black man can stand up and say that I've been elected to serve as our mayor. I didn't seek the office, though, of mayor because I am a black man or even to be the first elected black mayor. Let's be real, though. The symbolism isn't lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on anybody in this room either. This is an important moment in our city's history. So I hope that all the black and brown boys and girls who wake up tomorrow and they get ready for school, they do so knowing that what we have shown here today, that no matter where you live or how much or how little your parents make, and no matter the color of your skin, that in Milwaukee, there's a place for you too.
So, JR, this clearly creates a whole new chapter for the city of Milwaukee. And actually what I thought was interesting, on his first day, he hasn't been officially inaugurated into office, but on his first day he kind of talked with the press about how he really wants to start rebuilding this relationship with GOP leaders. He said he already had calls into Speaker Voss, Senate Majority Leader Devin Lemachue. So that's one thing I think that he kind of wants to set a new tone, because when Mayor Barrett was in office, I think a lot of us know that they butted heads pretty often. So that's kind of one thing that we'll kind of wait and see how that relationship pans out.
Yeah, I mean, Cavalier's reward for winning is a massive pension issue, perceptions about crime in the city, development, all kinds of other things just to deal with. And that pension issue, I think it may double to $140 million a year. So he has to put it into the pension fund to account for that burden. Without additional resources, that will result in cuts in services, potentially laying off police. You know, there's a bill that Republicans introduced this session that if you cut police forces, you would lose shared revenue. For a community like Milwaukee with this issue, what would you do? So Cavalier obviously wants to rebuild the relationship with the Republicans in the Capitol to try and get something done. The question is, what is the incentive of GOP lawmakers to help Milwaukee financially? There's been a call from Milwaukee leaders for years for a local sales tax or some kind of local tax where they can go ahead and generate revenue. Hasn't gone anywhere. What's different about Cavalier Johnson asking than Tom Barrett asking? Because different Republicans, what's their incentive to raise taxes? They don't really care for that kind of thing. So there's that issue. Couple things about the race. You can't really compare, I guess you can look at Cavalier hit a mark in terms of percentage of the vote that was as good or better than Barrett, except for one time. But the turnout was way different because Barrett ran during primary or during April elections when they had a presidential primary on the ballot. So Cavalier, there's nothing else on there except for the mayoral race. So no other reason. Well, a couple of county board races, stuff, not a whole lot.
Few.
One thing I wondered was, okay, because it's such a low turnout race, if there's really an enthusiasm, some kind of building thing about Republicans, a cratering of the Democratic brand in a place like Milwaukee, that would be like a red flag, warning sign for everybody. And it wasn't. There were Republicans who called, back Donovan. But he didn't do any better against Barrett. Actually did worse against Johnson than Barrett last time he ran against Barrett in 2016 on a percentage basis. Again, hard to compare because you're talking way bigger turnout in the other years. So, but for Cavalier, it was an inevitability pretty much from kind of January
Yeah.
He had the most money. He had the best campaign operation. The people who could have given the hardest time in a general election didn't get out of the primary. It was not really a surprise that he did as well as he did. But credit to his team for getting that number in that kind of race.
Absolutely, and he's been interim mayor for several months now, and he's had press events and, rolling out his plan on what it would look like under his administration, if he was sworn into office. So he had a pretty good opportunity to get his name out there, name recognition, and I think a lot of people thought, well, he probably has this in the bag, so there goes the kind of the turnout factor of many people saying, I'll skip this one, I'll wait till August type of thing. Another interesting race that a lot of people were paying attention to was the Court of Appeals for District 2. Maria Lazar came out on top. She was the candidate that was backed by conservatives. A lot of the Waukesha Republican Party poured some money into this race, and so she defeated a sitting judge, Lori Kornblum, who was appointed by Governor Tony Evers. And I believe this is the second time Republicans have knocked off an Evers an appointment for this race. A big central issue in this race was kind of this tough on crime perspective. Lazar had some campaign ads, but it was more outside groups that were really tying her opponent Kornblum to the Waukesha Christmas parade killing. So it's kind of interesting to see if that maybe was a driving factor for voters to get out. We know that's going to be widely talked about on the campaign.
This is what we expected to happen in this race. It was really a question of what the margin would be, because the Second District Court of Appeals is based in Waukesha County. It is kind of runs from Kenosha County up around Milwaukee. This is fertile Republican territory. A Democrat should not win in this district. Lisa Neubauer is the exception. Go back, she was appointed to the court by Jim Doyle in 2007, won a retention campaign on a law and order type campaign. Wasn't really making a lot of noise after that. 2019, ran for the Supreme Court. Became obvious that she's a left of center judge. Conservatives said, we're going to go after her in 2020 when she's on the ballot again in the appeals court. But there was a primary for president that drove Democratic turnout. She had a weak opponent. She had superior resources, and she won. She may be the last left of center judge to win on the Second District Court of Appeals for a long, long time. Go back a year ago. Jeff Davis had a lot of personal money, poured it in, lost, because Shelley Grogan ran a very aggressive campaign about how he was Evers' handpicked candidate. He was a liberal. This is, conservative Waukesha County, and she won by a bigger margin than Lazar did. Small difference, but still a bigger margin. What's interesting was Lori Kornblum only had a couple, 3 months to really burn in an image with voters. I mean, really, appeals court judges, how much they had in the news, in the press, in a good way, right? So, appointed by Evers, took the bench in January. Put her own money in, had more resources than Lazar, but those outside groups dropped six-figure buys, which leveled the playing field. Kornblum had an interesting ad that knocked Lazar because of a sentence in a rape case where I think the prosecutors wanted 7 years, something like that. She gave him 11 months or somewhere around there. An effective ad in a law and order environment that maybe helped, but really Kornblum was fighting against an uphill battle with the environment of this district, just its nature. What I'm curious about is going forward, if Evers had a chance to appoint somebody again, would you even bother, in a district like this? Because he's 0 for 2 now. It was much like the same thing with Scott Walker. Walker kept appointing judges to Milwaukee and Dane counties, and they kept losing because they had the Walker taint in liberal places. Now, not all of them did. A couple of them made it through. But Evers has the same issue. If you're a Democratic governor appointing a judge in a very conservative district, you're going to face an uphill battle. And governors don't like their appointees to lose. They want to put people in office who are going to stick around.
Of course.
So it's a
they
challenge
like having that
for you.
power, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of eyes too, and I think Republicans were kind of taking a victory lap, staying on the Waukesha topic, was a lot of school board races. I think Waukesha kind of took the title of a lot of headlines this week because they booted off two incumbents, 3. Once again, Republican-backed candidates are now going to be elected to these school board seats. We know for a very long time that these school board races have gotten a lot more attention over the years and a lot more money being funneled into them specifically. Now, of course, all these races we're talking about, Jay, are nonpartisan, but we've seen over the years, even just the last, I would say, few months, a lot of partisan politics are getting into these elections. I talked to a professor at UW Oshkosh who studies school board races. He kind of touched on the importance of keeping races nonpartisan. I think a lot of people want that It's probably not going to happen in this political environment. But he also just talked about how critical race theory, COVID protocols, all of those kind of national issues, of course there are some national or local issues here as well, how they really drive out the voter base. So let's take a listen.
One of the real advantages of nonpartisan races like school board races is that we don't bring in that entrenched conflict from the start. The increased engagement and interest in school board races is very important because school boards absolutely do matter, and having these races competitive give residents a means to hold their school districts accountable. But it's really important that we keep these things nonpartisan. We start bringing partisan politics into nonpartisan races, we really are hurting our ability to govern effectively at the local level. I think you're going to find if any of these candidates do win, they're going to get into a governing environment and realize that this is really not happening in these school districts anyways. So they're going to have to pivot into more substantive issues.
And speaking of money, JR, just the Waukesha County Republican Party poured in about $30,000 into school board races. Across the state, the Republican Party had about $70,000. Democrats, when I looked at state finance reports, were closer to $10,000 range just for school board races. So typically we don't see this type of money in these races. Also important to note that Rebecca Clayfish kind of took a odd stance that she endorsed 100 candidates. I have it right down here. 48 were school board and 34 of them won, beating 8 incumbents. So, you know, maybe this messaging of critical race theory, COVID-19 protocols is working and it's here to stay.
So my caution is when anybody talks about their endorsements, did they give that person money? Did they put infrastructure behind him or her? Because in my experience, endorsements only matter if you give them money or infrastructure. If it's just your name on something, not necessarily a big motivating factor. But what did happen was like Waukesha County GOP has something called WISRED, which was a program to identify who the real conservatives were or real Republicans for their base voters to let them know because they're nonpartisan races and to kind of identify this is the person we think you should vote for. The state party ran a dry run for November doing data and infrastructure. The national GOP, same thing, dry run for November. Democrats have not forgotten how to turn people out. They've done it before. They have their own programs. The difference is when you have the enthusiasm on your side, like the Republicans do, it's easier to get people out to the polls. What I noticed in talking to people is that critical race theory, for example, it worked in places where you were open to being moved by critical race theory. If you were a Democrat, you weren't moved by it. It did, or moderate Democrat, they didn't move those guys. Swingy places didn't really move them. Eau Claire, for example, they ran some folks, pro-CRT folks, didn't win any of those seats.
Same with Cross as well, yeah.
They're pockets of stuff, and it's hard to draw a firm conclusion of blanket saying CRT works or doesn't work off of what happened on Tuesday. But if you can combine it with other messages, you can have a potent effort to turn out conservative voters who are open to those messages.
I talked to Bill McCoshen, who's a Republican strategist, also kind of was on the fence about running as a Republican in the governor's race. And he kind of mentioned, you know, he is thinking that maybe the party shouldn't keep saying critical race theory. It's more about transparency, right? Widen out that message so it could be a whole host of everything, right? They want to know what's going on with curriculum, so it doesn't have to be so, I guess, stark that critical race theory is happening in schools, because a lot of school districts and a lot of school officials say that it's not happening, it's not being taught in schools. Republicans think otherwise, so it's definitely here to stay, but maybe just saying let's have our, you know, parents, grandparents have more transparency over school districts. That could maybe work better, who knows.
I got the impression Republicans have a right or earn the opportunity to be a little kind of braggy about how they did on Tuesday. They had more wins than Democrats did.
Yeah, I was just about to get to that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's actually hear from the party leaders themselves and we'll talk to that. This is our next slide that both, of course, are claiming victory on after Tuesdays. Mark Jefferson, the Republican Party of Wisconsin's executive director, said parents are fed up with far-left school boards who have kept students out of the classroom and implemented divisive curriculum and put teacher union over schools. And Ben Wickler said, well, progressives are coming from a position of extraordinary strength in school board elections. Red areas are turning into the underlying political makeup that represents a kind of progression, the mean rather than a shift. So Democrats weren't too worried, I would say, about these results, but both parties have to worry, right? I mean, they still have a lot more work to do come August and November.
April elections aren't great predictors of November results. Don't forget, in 2018, Rebecca Dallett won a race for Supreme Court by 11 points as a progressive left-of-center type candidate. Tony Evers won that fall by 1.1 points. We are a purple state. The turnout, the electorate in April is older, whiter, more conservative than in November. Now, it doesn't mean that Republicans shouldn't brag about what happened on Tuesday or point to their successes, but I caution anybody who says, because what happened on Tuesday,
right,
X will happen in November. It could be a great year for Republicans still, but not because what happened on Tuesday. It will be other factors that drive November's results.
And like we've talked about, this is supposed to be the year, so of course they're going to try to capitalize this, but they got to carry it to August and they got to carry it to November. Also, one other thing Bill McCoshen said is, yeah, sure, we did great in the suburbs of Milwaukee, but we didn't do so great in Madison and Milwaukee County, because we know those are very, very blue counties that, you know, Republicans are trying to make up their game there. They're trying to build something because of how many people turn out each election in both of those counties. So definitely something to look forward to as we inch closer to the primary. Also, another kind of development this week was the ongoing lawsuits that are requesting numerous documents from Assembly Speaker Robin Vos regarding his and Gableman's election investigation. On Thursday, a judge ruled to stop searches on Vos's personal cell phone for deleted text messages and emails related to this election investigation. Now, this comes after a cybersecurity expert testified in court that was hired by Vos's attorney that basically said it's really unlikely that you'd be able to find those deleted text messages and emails on his personal account. Now, Vos did actually tell us, his attorney, right before the court hearing happened, that they did turn over somewhere between 10 to 20,000 emails from his state legislative email account. Now, this is all about the request, to try to increase transparency by the liberal watchdog group American Oversight. Before we kind of dive into what this means, let's hear from the cybersecurity expert and the judge in her ruling, basically saying let's stop with the cell phone stuff. Let's maybe try to move on to other documents that we could possibly find.
If those text messages have been deleted 6 to 9 months ago on an iPhone 11 or a Samsung S21, do you expect that you're going to be able to find them as a result of a full file recovery?
If the phones were turned off immediately after the text messages were deleted and had never been turned on since and were provided to me, there's a reasonably good chance I would be able to recover the text messages that were deleted. If, however, the phones were in some kind of use in the intervening 6 to 9 months, I would, in my experience, based on the phones I've worked on over the years, I would consider it to be highly unlikely to find text messages from that long ago.
I mean, this is someone who has a personal phone. There may be other personal things on there. I just don't see that at this point any more time, expense, or money is really relevant to the issues at hand to see if there's possibly some way to recover deleted messages on a private phone. Granted, Speaker Vos is the Speaker of the House, but he also is a private citizen, and I don't see how you can separate his private messages from his public messages if, in fact, you could even recover deleted messages, which I think is doubtful.
So, JR, it's kind of important to note that this is one of 3 lawsuits by American Oversight, so it can get a little confusing because last week we talked about how Vos was in a separate case held in contempt of court for not producing records about the election investigation, and he has until next week to produce those requests, or he will face a $1,000 fine per day he doesn't. This case was kind of asking for similar records, but more about Vos's personal cell phone and his Gmail account. So I guess, they got some stuff, but we don't really know what's in those emails yet because there's so many. There's possibly duplicates, and some of the records that we heard from Vos's attorney date back from 2010. So there could be a lot of stuff in there.
So a lot of this is about transparency with the Gableman investigation. It's also about putting Vos on the spot because he opened the door to this investigation and making life difficult for him. And if he's not turning over the records, they're going to put the screws to him. Oh, by the way, that fine $1,000 a day, I don't think he's going to pay it. Taxpayers will.
I don't think so either. Historically, with these cases, Patrick was on last week when you were out, and we kind of talked about other cases with other lawmakers in the past. Usually taxpayers are the ones that are going to have to foot the bill. Unfortunately, I do just want to highlight on some kind of Gableman updates with his investigation. He's been kind of going on this victory tour, talking to Donald Trump, going to a lot of events with Donald Trump, and a lot of election deniers recently. He was just on Steve Bannon's podcast last night, who is Trump's former White House chief or advisor, basically he told people that, well, Voss wants me to wrap up my office, and they're sending staffers to my office on April 24th to pack it up. So he's basically telling his supporters, well, go call Voss. Say, we need to keep this election investigation going. Gableman's contract will end, for now, the contract will end at the end of this month. So we'll see what happens, but it seems like this might be wrapping up. But on the other side, JR, his subpoenas are still being fought in court. The next court hearing for those are not until July. So yes. It's really just up in the air where this goes and how much longer this is going to be carried out, because I think we've predicted that, of course, I think some Republicans want them to keep this, keep their base fired up heading into the primaries. But court dates are still not going to happen until much later this summer about trying to compel mayors to sit down with Gableman for private depositions.
Voss raised the prospect of pulling back the subpoenas, right? Because he said it's because they give immunity to those who comply with them. That would prevent a future Republican Attorney General from going after him.
That was 2 weeks ago, and we haven't heard anything. Yeah.
So there's that. Yes. Remember the amended contract that he signed, Voss and Gableman, allowed the continued legal representation about these lawsuits. So, yes, the probe itself may wrap up, but there's an opening for still some taxpayer money to be spent on legal bills going forward, because there's a question of what is the authority of a special counsel to compel people to testify in private in a private office space versus doing it in public in front of a legislative committee. So that's still out there and will be out there for a while.
All right, let's get to stock picks this week. Rising, you have Samantha Kirkman, who did fairly well for herself in the Kenosha County executive election.
So first Republican to be Kenosha County executive maybe ever. These nonpartisan races, sometimes the labels get blurred a little bit, but she ran as a Republican, won the seat, became a national talking point in the process. Now again, what happens in April is not a great predictor of what happens in November. That said, for Republicans, they're zeroing on Kenosha County because they think Evers is vulnerable there, right? The Kenosha County violent protests or Kenosha violent protests in 2020 after the Jacob Blake shooting. Kirkman told me she ran a law and order campaign, also banked on experience in Madison that helped, and asking folks on what happened in this race. The person she ran against already was a countywide elected official, the clerk of circuit courts. He had the backing of both the outgoing county executive Jim Cruiser, former Democratic lawmaker, as well as a sheriff who was a big Trump supporter. That was interesting. But again, endorsements matter if you use them the right way. And Kirkman ran a better campaign, it seems like, had a better operation around her with the local party than her opponent, who seemed like maybe had the better skill set to be prepared for the job on day one, but didn't run the right campaign to win the job. So there's that. Nationally became, here is a Republican who flipped a county after decades of Democratic leadership. The caveat to that is Jim Cruiser was no flaming liberal in the legislature. He's pretty pro-business, moderate Democrat. Alan Keel, his predecessor, had been sheriff, not really known as progressives in law and order in Kenosha County for sheriff. He had little legal problems on his own as well. It's another story. But Kenosha County has been doing well. Kenosha County has had Amazon move in, the U-Lines have moved. Yeah. There's been a business boom in Kenosha County. That said, there still is this law and order issue. Is it going to be potent come November? One caveat to all this, as well, along with the April, not necessarily November, Kornblum won Kenosha County in her appeals court race with Lazar. If there really is a cratering of the Democratic brand in Kenosha County, how'd that happen? Because Lazar made Kornblum's appointment by Evers a central part of her campaign. I mean, she was Evers' handpicked liberal. There were all the ads, so what happened there? Well, maybe Kornblum ran that ad about Lazar with the rape case. Maybe it cut into the law and order issue. But my point is, there's not a clear, convincing message out of Kenosha County from Tuesday, particularly because you can't bank on what happened Tuesday carrying over to November. But I'd still not feel great if I were Tony Evers about my prospects in Kenosha County come November, because those folks haven't forgotten that happened in 2020.
Absolutely. Mixed this week is, I think, a few headlines in here in JR with the field of Republicans running for governor. Nicholson sent out a release this week touting that he's kind of closing the gap in his poll against Clayfish, but of course we always take these polls with a little grain of salt because of who they're talking to.
So I'm sure you guys talked last week about Tommy Thompson and his trip down to Florida. So that's going on. Eric Hovde and Tim Michels are still out there. By the way, you can circulate nomination papers 1 week from today for statewide office. Now, we can't do it for legislative races because of the maps aren't in place as we talk here at
I was like
Friday morning.
Hold our breath.
But we're a week out, and it's still not a settled field. I get the impression from Tommy Thompson in Florida that he wants to run. I don't know the people around him want him to run because they see him coming off this high of being system president, a great cap to a long career of public service in Wisconsin. They're like, go out on a high note. Let's not do this because it might not end well. By the way, the base has changed a lot since
you were last in office, yeah.
Same time, Diane Hendricks went to Florida with Tommy Thompson for this meeting. She is a mega donor in Republican circles. There is a yearning among some people of like, let's get back to like normalcy, get away from the stop the steal stuff, all this. Let's get back to a statesman like a Tommy Thompson. I just know the people around him want Tommy to run and they want to protect him and his legacy. Meanwhile, Eric Hovde and Tim Michels still out there floating with it. The vibe, it seems like these days, is Hovde is less likely than Michels. I just don't know that either will get in. Both Hovde and Michels have flirted with bids often, and Tommy has.
Yeah, definitely.
This also goes to Rebecca Clayfish. There is a segment of the professional political class among Republicans who aren't convinced either that she can win or that she'd be a good governor. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for this, right? She was, no offense to TV people, a TV reporter. I don't think I'd be qualified to be governor off of that. But anyway, she doesn't have a deep resume of public service before being lieutenant governor. Now, 8 years lieutenant governor, won elections, won a recall election. But there's this perception of would she be the best person to beat Tony? Also, we both know there's a little bit of sexism in politics sometimes.
Yes, there is.
So there's a little bit maybe of underestimating her because she is a woman, with the first one elected governor, if you were to win. There's that whole issue, right? But it goes into the perception of a lack of confidence in her among some. Not everybody, but some. She's also done the most work to build the grassroots network ahead of this election. So there's all that going on. Now Kevin Nicholson's coming in, the super PAC, which began it says $1 million TV buy on his behalf. Talk about he's a doer, those kinds of things. They did a poll in January and then one again in late March. They say it moved dramatically. Now remember we talked about Alex Lasry, right?
Correct.
He spent $3.5 million on TV from November, I think it was, through February.
Yeah.
As he moved. This is one buy, $1 million. Now, I'm sounding skeptical because maybe I'm a little bit. Like, that's not a huge buy to burn in a massive move. But we don't know for sure how the poll was done, like what questions were asked before. So there's all that kind of stuff going on. That said, Clayfish has got a lot of stuff to worry about right now. She's got Nicholson over here. She's got these other guys flirting over here. Oh, Tim Rantham is still like making noise. There's a lot of stuff going on. For Democrats, the messier it is.
It's great for. I mean, yeah, of course they're going to want to try to capitalize on this. They're probably grinning ear to ear that this is pretty messy right now for Republicans. And also with the whole non-endorsement option too. I think it was in the Wisconsin State Journal that the executive director of the Republican Party, Mark Jefferson, said that they're going to meet again to possibly put a non-endorsement option back on the ballot, basically, when they have their convention party. It used to be, years ago, it used to be an option, and they got rid of it. So that's a whole other thing. That's maybe his movement that he's wanted all along, it might be working. But then he also said, I think it was a few weeks ago, that, well, I kind of want the endorsement now, but I'm still rallying for the non-endorsement option. So there's just a lot to keep up with this in total. And one thing I want to say about Tommy Thompson, too, is if he does get in this race, he is going to have to face those questions about the election. Do you think it was stolen? Do you think there's widespread fraud? I mean, that's what's mainly all these candidates are being asked about. So well, it remains to be seen about what Tommy ultimately does. All right, we only got a few seconds. Seconds, I should say. Let's wrap this up in about a minute. Falling this week, you have Eric Jenrich.
So, Green Bay mayor. Republicans talk about how many seats they flipped on various boards and control they have. Green Bay politics can be more about personnel than partisanship sometimes. Local politics are like that at times. So I don't know if there's really a conservative majority on the city council right now, or if there's like this kind of weird coalition of various groups. But Genrick's life is much more difficult right now than it was before Tuesday. Remember, the whole Stop the Steal crowd was up in Green Bay running ads, the city council races. So now he's got a more difficult environment at the city council. He's facing a recall. David Vanderleest, who ran against Dave Hansen for Senate recall in 2011, spearheading it. Vanderleest has his own legal issues from his past. That said, he's got until like the end of May to gather 9,700 signatures, I think it is, to trigger recall. Don't know if it'll happen, but that's out there. The spotlight is going to be that much more intense on Genrick come November about the election, because you had November 2020, February, right? They posted the wrong time to start counting ballots for the public notice. That wasn't a good look.
Didn't look good.
Now you've got November, and oh, by the way, he's up for re-election a year from now. So this all leads into a very difficult time for Eric Genrick of how is he going to manage this new city council, how is he going to manage his election, and how does it set him up for re-election in 2023 if he doesn't get recalled this year.
All right, that will do it. Thanks so much, JR. We'll see you guys next week. I'm Emilee Fannon.
And I'm JR Ross.
Thanks for joining us.
This program was brought to you from the Margaret Farrow Studio.
Rewind. Your Week in Review is sponsored by the Wisconsin Realtors Association, bringing Wisconsin communities to life with great homes, businesses, and neighborhoods. The Wisconsin Realtors Association, the voice of real estate.